Okay, so this video is the second part on political life, on the art of legislation, the distribution of wealth, the rectification of wrongs, the pleasure that comes from profit, the business sector, um, and equity, learning how to apply the laws in a particular situation. These are the kinds of things that we talk about and we do as fellow citizens in relationship to people we don't know personally. Okay, so I left off with the business sector of society, and I think Aristotle he's anti-ideological. He will say virtue is not in a formula. You can't say, oh, the private sector economy is great, so that's it, or government controlled economy is it. That's virtue. No. Justice is rule for the well being of the ruled. In the business sector, it's running a business for the well being of everyone, of humanity. Okay, so starting there, what's the best way to do it? And that should be the object of wish, is that you run businesses. A society regulates or doesn't regulate its business sector in a way that promotes human flourishing. Now, just like Aristotle said that citizens have to have virtue, or else the legal system is nothing but keeping people off of each other's backs, keeping people from harming each other, as opposed to the highly dignified art of bringing people together, making their lives comfortable enough so they have leisure time, so they have time and money to be generous, so they have time to engage in the arts or intellectual curiosity or political engagement, time to talk about political life. You want to give people not only their bare needs, but enough to have some leisure time and to have some extra resources so they can live the good life, not mere life. Okay, so how do we deal with the business sector? Now, both Plato and Aristotle said greed, the desire for more than your share, is what destroys political community. This is not the popular notion as of 2015 in the United States. Private greed, public benefit, that was one book. People used to talk like that all the time. It's like Aristotle would say, no way, Jose. um, why? Because money sticks to money. You can say it's an equal table, everybody gets a chance to make money, but that's not true. As soon as there is any kind of inequality in the system, if people's only goal is money, then people with money can rig the system. They can bribe politicians, they can control who makes the laws, they can punish lawmakers if they don't make the laws in their interests. In a democratic society, they can pay for political campaigns to distort the judgment of the public. So they'll vote for politicians that act in their interests. They can select politicians that will act in their interest and pay for their campaigns. They can basically control the political process. That's how oligarchs take over a society. Um, so and if greed is the collective value, that will always happen because um, those with more will always figure out how to keep the gap between the rich and the poor bigger and bigger. And so there always has to be intervention in the market. in some way. The art of legislation has to involve that. The other problem is that when people don't know the difference between natural needs and unnatural needs, Aristotle talks about the art of acquisition. And there's two kinds of household acquisition. Natural household acquisition is when people buy the things they need in order to flourish. And unnatural acquisition is obviously they're indulgent. They're buying too much or buying things they don't need. They've lost track of the difference between their wants and their needs. And that's a very destabilizing situation for a society as a whole, because people will just keep taking that farther and farther. And not only will there be a gap between the rich and the poor, but many of the people will be self indulgent. They won't develop their capacities well, they'll underachieve, or they'll be incompetent on the job because of self indulgence. Many, many ways that things break down, and people depend on each other to be trustworthy, to have goodwill, to exercise their skills for the well being of the people who need them, to exercise their authority as parents, as employees, as students, as teachers, everything. We all depend on each other completely. And the higher level of capacity we want to develop, the more we depend on each other. So, if you have this ethos that greed is good, you're in trouble. Now, what we have also in the U.S. is what I would call the capitalist industrial complex. We have way too many people making way too much money on other people's excess desires and using their wealth to pay for political campaigns so that the laws will be made or not made in their favor. So we have a medical industry, we have a agricultural industrial complex. Certain corn can be subsidized so that corporations that use corn syrup in their product can sell cheaper, can make their products cheaper, and then the corn syrup obviously causes diabetes and heart disease. So everybody's benefiting from the excess desires and the vices of their fellow citizens. The pharmaceutical industrial complex, the disability industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex. When people benefit from war economically, when people benefit from having people in prison, when people benefit from obesity, when people benefit from all sorts of vices, it's a dysfunctional system. The object of wish, there's always for the sake of some good, increasing the GNP, giving people jobs, letting people be free to do what they want. There's always an idea of the good, but Aristotle would not agree with that because ultimately it's all about greed. And decisions are made. The systems are structured around these choices, and they become huge self. They become dependent on each other. Then the percentage of jobs that people get now that actually depend upon government deficit spending or people's vices, not only obesity or crime or war, inciting wars so he can have jobs, but the fear of death. The healthcare industry plays on that. The fear of pain, so we have all sorts of products sold. The fear of not being socially accepted unless one has a certain physical appearance, the desire for pleasure. So, pleasure, pain, and fear are being exploited by our economic system in order to make money, and it's not healthy. It's not a flourishing society. It's a society that's starting to depend more and more on crippling people, on vice. Okay, and then the other one would be the medical profession. If doctors should be motivated by promoting health as part of human flourishing, what happens when they're really motivated by money? Um, that's a problem. The legal system, the rule of law is great. It's the best kind of society is one that has the rule of law. But when that gets corrupted so that people go into the legal system in order to make money or in order to gain power, then the system has fallen apart. And this happened in Athens, right? People, if you wanted to make it, you hired someone to teach you how to speak persuasively. You went into the assembly. You could get citizens to do what you wanted, so you could have power. You could go into juries and make a lot of money getting people off, and you could be, that's how you get wealthy, how you use your expertise in the legals, manipulating the legal system to make money. That's corrupt. But people do have those goals. This doesn't happen by accident, and they have an idea of the good. Well, it's a free country. It's a free economy. It's everybody wants this, and I'm successful, and I get status by making money because I'm respected as being a successful person. Uh, anyway, it's not healthy. I think in that sense, we've become Troy, the city dedicated to pleasure and wealth. But we also have some people whose goal is power. But I think mostly our weakness in the U.S. is greed. Okay, so the other thing, okay, so those are all voluntary activities. Um, People voluntarily structure things. It's nobody's holding a gun to their head, nobody's making them do something. They just, Aristotle would say, they just have the wrong idea of the goal. They have the wrong idea of human flourishing, and they're going to create a system of human dysfunction because they're dysfunctional. So the system feeds on itself. It's just self-destructive, and it's dysfunctional, and it does not promote human flourishing. Now, there's other kinds of actions where you have to question whether they're voluntary or not. There's certain actions that are involuntary. They appear to be voluntary, but they're not. Actions done from ignorance. For example, you punish the wrong person because you were misinformed about who committed the crime, or in a more personal setting, your child. You punish your child for something the child didn't actually do. Okay, so you make a mistake about who is involved. You make a mistake about what they actually did. You think that they did this misdeed when actually it was somebody else who did it. Um, Things like that. All sorts of stuff where you can get things wrong. And again, tragedies are full of this. Tragedies are full of all of these things. Life is full of all of these things. Good literature is full of all of these things because they're trying to educate you by showing you types of people in types of situations that you can identify with. That's how you learn. Okay, so those are involuntary actions. Some of them are done by force. You're forced to do something. And some of them are done from ignorance. Okay, what about voluntary actions? Um, the ones you're responsible for. Okay, there's another kind of action done in ignorance that you are responsible for. For example, you did it when you were drunk or on drugs. Well, you were responsible for getting drunk and being on drugs. You did it motivated by emotion. Your emotions took over from your reason, so you weren't thinking. You might have been motivated by anger or greed. I remember in the S&L crisis in the 80s, somebody who got involved in that savings and loan scandal went in front of the court and said, I couldn't help it because the laws were so tempting that I couldn't resist temptation. But I don't think he won his case. I mean, he was trying to appeal to the jury, saying it was involuntary because, my gosh, this huge profit was just there for the picking. Wait a second. So he was trying to blame the laws. And naturally, nobody who could get that rich that quickly and easily could possibly be responsible for actually doing it. Yeah, really. Fear. People can be motivated by fear, but they're still responsible. And people can be motivated by friendship, right? I broke the law because I was helping my friend. No. So that's the claim that you're done. It's done in ignorance because you're motivated by emotion. You're still responsible. The other type is that you're responsible for is when you were motivated because you don't know the human good, right? You knew you were committing adultery, but you didn't know there was anything wrong with it. Yeah, really. You knew you were taking revenge, but you didn't know there was anything wrong with that. You knew you were motivated by success, but you didn't know there was anything, so you broke the law or hurt somebody else. You're still responsible. This could be something that wouldn't be taken to court. This could be you unjustly demean somebody or ostracize them or give them a bad reputation because it helps you be more successful. And so you don't take responsibility. I couldn't help it. That was a situation. That's just from ignorance of the human good, that it's wrong and you're responsible for it anyway. Okay, then the other one is if you're under duress, you know the good, but you compromise. Okay, either because you fear greater evils, right? If you don't do this, something bad is going to happen. Or if it's a means to a greater good, right? The end justifies the means. So you do this because you'll get praised for it, or because, well, just someone could do something that's morally wrong, but they're in order to please their friends. It's the means to that greater good. Or they'll get blamed for not doing something. Or, okay, the other one is you fear a greater evil. Well, somebody can, and this is a big theme in one of the plays, Agamemnon. Somebody can know that they're neglecting their children. They're never home because they're working all the time. But they do it because they fear not being able to pay their bills. They fear they fear losing their job. They fear not being successful. And so they neglect their children and they say, it's under duress, I don't have a choice. And the truth is, it's still voluntary. You're still responsible. So you have to figure out how to compromise, how to deal with the situation. But just to say, it's not my fault, I'm not going to take responsibility, doesn't really help anybody. It doesn't help your children either. So those are the kind of examples that Aristotle gives. And there are tons of examples in Greek tragedies where people are saying, I can't help it, it wasn't my fault, blah, blah. because the tragedies show situations that are difficult. That's why, um, that's why the tragedian presented them. He wants you to start thinking about what you're responsible for, what you're not, what the human good is. How would you make this decision in this situation? Well, which choices promote the human good better than others? And always the goal is to promote human flourishing. Yourself, the people you know, and your society. And those are never split. When somebody makes a bad choice, when someone takes revenge, they ruin themselves and their reputation. They ruin their future. They ruin everybody around them. And they ruin their societies because they're citizens in a society. Okay? They undermine everything. When people promote flourishing, they flourish, the people around them flourish, their societies flourish. Now, certainly, sometimes it's not all that rosy and it's difficult, but overall, a good person is also a good citizen. And we all know that most societies are corrupt to various degrees, and they end up ostracizing or marginalizing some of their best citizens for all the wrong reasons. I mean, Socrates is given the hemlock. We know this doesn't always happen. Aristotle was left Athens because he was afraid he was going to be given the hemlock. But Aristotle is not going to concede that. He's not going to say that a good person is a bad citizen, because what that concedes is that if you know justice by nature and you have the capacity to evaluate your society and criticize it because it doesn't promote flourishing, because, for example, it's got the wrong goal. It's aiming toward wealth, or it's aiming toward power, or it's aiming toward freedom that's just leading to dissipation of energies. So a citizen who criticizes is a good citizen if they're criticizing for the right reason in the right way. They're the greatest gift to a city because they tell it what's wrong with it. So a good person is a good citizen by nature, even though many times, sometimes they're killed for it, sometimes they're banished for it, but a lot more often they're not popular. They are marginalized. They can't win elections. They aren't given positions of power or authority. Either if their profession is corrupt, they're not going to get positions in their profession. If a doctor, family practice doctors, the ones that emphasize wellness, aren't given the money or status of the ones that are more specialized. So it goes on and on. It's just that in theory and intuitively, it should be intuitively obvious that at the end of the day, to promote human flourishing is to be a good citizen. Okay, and then I'll talk a little bit more about Aristotle's politics. Just, there's no way I can go through the whole book, but the overall idea I want to give people is that a study not of Aristotle's book, it's too dense, it's too difficult, but a summary of Aristotle, basically, could be a great kind of undergraduate education for liberal studies. There's a lot of other things that could too, and I'm not taking sides so much. I just want to say that it would have to be taught with an open mind. It would have to be taught with the assumption that racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia are wrong, and stop projecting that. Even if Aristotle was that way, if he came back, he wouldn't be that way. if he has the kind of open mind that he prided himself on having. So let's just take the theory and detach ourselves from our own habits and associations. Now, I've used certain examples when I've talked about these things that are very much about my own life. So you just have to use your imagination to think about, okay, how would we evaluate um, the behavior of people on somebody that Margaret Mead studied in terms of Aristotle's virtues? And you can. It's not a problem because it's all based on the human condition. Pleasure, pain, fear, friendship, anger, generosity, sociability, humor, truthfulness. Um, and again, a society with lower levels of education, people are not as self-consciously aware, people don't sit and deliberate about all these distinctions, can still be a society where the moral virtues are exercised more than they are in a society where people talk all the time but do not exercise virtue, or they call greed a virtue. So you can have a very sophisticated high-tech society where people are barbarians because they think greed is a virtue. That's barbaric. Okay, so morally, they're perverted, they're corrupt, they're sick, but intellectually, they're highly, developed and highly sophisticated. So Aristotle's other virtues, which were, Aristotle had um, some other points to make, would be that besides the moral virtues, there are intellectual virtues, math, science, understanding the first principles of things, which are not necessarily tied to character at all. Now, in a flourishing human being, they would be. And scientific knowledge and medicine would all be subsumed under human flourishing, and the exercise of those intellectual powers would be dedicated to human flourishing. Often doesn't happen, and again, many of those stories are about that theme. The other thing Aristotle says that's very important is that a society, a constitution, the way society is set up politically is not just or unjust depending upon the structure. It's just or unjust depending upon how power is exercised. So, the 6 different types are the rule of one person, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many. Those are the 3 alternatives in terms of who rules. Now, each of them can be just or unjust, and they are fundamentally different societies based on how the authority is exercised, not based on who is exercising it and how they came to get that power. So a monarchy, if a ruler inherited power from the family member because they were next in line, and they use their power for the well-being of the ruled, that's a monarchy. If a person has absolute power and either they took over by force or I think by inheritance, and they use their power to exploit the ruled. They use it for the for the benefit of themselves. They take people to war for power or money or some other personal vendetta, revenge. That's an abuse of power. A tyranny is the perversion of the rule of one. If you have the rule of the few, um, if it's if those few people have come to gain power because of merit, and they actually have more power because they know how to use power and how to do it well, that's an aristocracy, the rule of the best. Now, if it's a group of families, a small elite class, that have power and inherit power because they're rich, that's an oligarchy, and that's an abuse of power. To have power simply because you're rich is unjust. If you have the rule of the masses, so that the people who have political power get it through elections, that's the rule of the majority. Okay, if those people are self-controlled and generous, if they have the virtues, especially the political virtues, then you have a just democracy and a healthy democracy. If the people in a society that elects its rulers are self-indulgent, greedy, stingy, they want as much as they can get, they don't know the difference between their wants and their needs, they and they have no goodwill for each other. They're just doing nothing but competing against each other for power and wealth, even though they elect their officials. What they'll do is they'll elect people who promote their interests, or who to find some demon to blame so that they can indulge themselves, deceive them in some way that is going to make them even more corrupt. That's a dysfunctional democracy. It's an unjust society. So we don't even have a different name for it, but it's a fundamentally different kind of society. Now, Aristotle says, in any one country at any one time, there's one best society because of the conditions. So sometimes a monarchy is best if there's a tradition of the certain family ruling for the well-being of the ruled, and if you tried to have elections, or if you tried to distribute the power better, the society would fall into chaos. People would be worse off. Now, there's a couple examples of an absolute leader ruling justly that sort of stand out. One is Singapore and one is Turkey. Ataturk took over the area after World War I. The Turkey had sided with the wrong side, the losers, and Greece, Britain, and France. There were three countries that really wanted to carve out Turkey and make it their own. They were the losers, and winner takes all. So Mr. Ataturk had been a military leader, and he led a nationalist movement and got people to fight back. And then he did shoo away the enemies, and he was elected president, and he just exercised absolute power. He changed the legal system so that it would be a constitutional system after he stepped down. He changed the jury system so that it would be more egalitarian. He changed education. He made education more accessible. He made it accessible to women. He changed the clothing people wore. He changed the numerical system. He changed the measurement system so that he changed the language. He tried to get his country into the modern world. And within 5 years, 7 years, an amazing leap forward. And Turkey so far has not had those kind of social diseases that the other countries right next to Turkey have. So I think Ataturk was a political genius. He knew how to take a society that was falling apart and um, and mold it into a society that could become self-governing and could become governed by the rule of law after he stepped down. And it was that's what I consider political genius. But that's an example where absolute power is not necessarily bad. The next example of an aristocracy that's not necessarily bad is in oh, it's in a Mideast country. Jeez. Anyway, Queen Noor was there, and they have a ruling aristocracy. Okay, and the family rules for the well-being of the ruled, according to our definition, and we like them, and we support them, and they have real troubles with refugees coming in all the time. They have a lot of instability. They have a lot of members of their society that, if they had a free election, they would elect a theocracy. The majority of the people in their society want the Sharia law. And according to us, well, according to Aristotle, truly, I think, it would not promote the flourishing of as many people as possible to the highest level possible. And this is a case where you'd have to bring in a contemporary interpretation of Aristotle, because Sharia law discriminates against women horribly, and I assume Aristotle would agree that he was wrong about women, that they are capable of theoretical thinking. Talk about an insult. Here I am defending Aristotle because he's a great theoretician and he didn't think I was capable of it. But okay, you know, when you're born not of the prevailing whatever, race, sex, gender, whatever, you have to cope. But I still think you can separate the theory from the particular application. And in this case, so we support the ruling aristocracy in that society, and I agree with that. Um, anyway, so then we have China, and China is more authoritarian, has a stronger government, a lot more taxes, a lot more services. But Aristotle's not ideological. He's not going to say it's wrong for that reason. He's going to say, does it promote human flourishing? Is it the best kind of society given that context? America has a different context, different than Europe. So there's one best form of government for each nation. But nations have to constantly be deliberating about that because conditions change. So the form of government might change. It might be best for the form of government to change. Also, you can have a certain form of government, and the same form of government can at one time be a flourishing democracy and at another time be an oligarchy, because the laws, the structure of the government's the same, but the actual way it functions is for the benefit of the rich. Or you could have a democracy and have the same structure and basically be a military empire building society because the military is taking control of the system. And you can have the same system where you have citizens who are generous and self-controlled, or you can have the system where they're indulgent and stingy. A democracy where people are basically mini tyrants becomes unstable, and usually you can have the same structure again, but if people don't govern themselves, the society is actually going to become more authoritarian. even if the constitutional structure doesn't change on the surface. And this is where, again, justice is a character trait, and a society is just according to how people live, not, you can't hide behind a constitutional structure. You have to just focus on really who the people are. Are they good people? If they're good people, they're good citizens. Do they get respected as good citizens? What does that tell you about the society when they don't? And people have to be constantly talking about this and how the spirit of their nation can change, okay? The letter of the law is the same. The spirit of the law changes because the spirit of the people changes. And by spirit, I mean, what is it they're living for? They're living for some idea of the good. What is that idea of the good? And that will affect, more importantly, that's more important than the particular structure of the society. Some societies, a monarchy, Aristotle says, the best form of society is actually a polity, which is a mix of aristocracy and democracy, because some people really do know better than others how to create laws and how to apply laws in a way that promotes human flourishing. So that those people should exercise more power, not just political power, but also power in the corporate sector, in the business sector, power in education, power in healthcare, power in the legal system. And they don't, not every position should be elected, because the people can't always recognize who has the expertise and who really is exercising for their well-being, because they don't understand the complexities or difficulties. So some positions are appointed. So then the problem is you have to make sure that the people who are doing the appointing are just. Anyway, some positions are appointed and some positions are elected. Why? Because if you have all appointed, of course, you have corruption because you don't have any accountability to the public. If you have all elected positions, the people can be fooled by demagogues, people who use political rhetoric to manipulate them, especially to punch their buttons. The poor resent the rich, so somebody who wanted political power can demonize the rich unjustly. They could demonize any kind of power, in which case you wouldn't have the expertise you need to run the society. They could appeal to fear, people's fears, anxieties. There's all sorts of buttons that a politician can push in the people to gain power. And that's another important function of tragedy, Greek mythology, Homer, is to try and get people to be critical thinkers. You hear these stories about corrupt characters who are ruling and pulling the wool over the eyes of the average guy, and the average guy hears these stories, knows these characters, watches them. I was like, oh, they're trying to educate citizens so they won't be duped. It's very ingenious. I really admire what the Greeks were trying to do. I don't know the sweep of human history. I do not know every culture or anything, but I guess the standard thing is that the Greeks stand out in terms of their political genius, their efforts to create a society of self-governing citizens who can take turns ruling and being ruled, a society that tries to cultivate the powers of the soul in the citizens at a higher level that they learn how to treat each other as citizens, that they develop the political virtues, that they develop justice, and then they can analyze the political process, the laws, they can adapt, they can change them, they can adapt to circumstances, things like that. So, and I'll talk about that more as we go on. One last thing about Aristotle's politics is he makes so many interesting distinctions about how to rule well. He has so many variables about what it is that leads to corruption. Um, and he has this idea of human flourishing. Okay, you could say, well, that's too idealistic. But he's not, right? That is accompanied by tragedy, Homer, Greek mythology, Plato, so that people really are savvy about how to promote flourishing, and they're not naive, and they're not blind or ignorant, and they can figure out, okay, I want human flourishing, that's the object of wish. Okay, what are your options in this situation? Because sometimes your options are way, way far away from flourishing, and yet one option is always better than the other ones. So you have many characters in situations where, wow, they're between a rock and a hard place, except that either the rock or the hard place is a little softer and the other one is a little harder. And that's what it means to have power. That's not an exception to the rule. That's the rule. That's how you literally create a better world, is you literally chip away. Chip away at it. Chip away at the hard place. Find the softer one and start chipping. And that's how you make things better. Okay, so he has all of these distinctions that he makes. And he always ends up with the idea he's talking to rulers. He analyzes constitutions as more or less likely to lead to a strong and stable middle class over time. And he's talking to leaders, and he's telling them consistently, if you really want to maintain your power, the best strategy is to actually rule for the well-being of the ruled. Duh. So over time, in general, justice pays, and injustice harms, is self-destructive. So if you're a tyrant, for example, you have two strategies. You can actually start distributing your power, or you can actually create this horrible tyranny where everybody's ratting. You give people the opportunity to rat on everyone, just take control, have a few bodyguards. And he just says, that usually doesn't last. You just make people so mad, eventually they'll rebel. The other strategy is to actually be more just. Appear just and then actually be just. And you're more likely to be trusted with power, and people are less likely to rebel. Oh. Same with your aristocracy. If you want your children and grandchildren to continue to inherit this power, you should actually be just and not create animosity. If you try to use rhetoric to deceive people, eventually they'll find out. Or eventually you'll create these terrible circumstances where they might not even blame you, but they're going to rebel and want something better, or something they think is better. So that's, again, at the end of the day, the Greek view combines complete realism. It's so realistic. It looks at every weakness, injustice, every horror of human beings, every kind of wickedness, every kind of extreme, every kind of lousy set of alternatives, every kind of lousy character, every kind of dysfunctional family, every kind of dysfunctional society. And yet, it sticks to that model of a flourishing human life, a flourishing society, using rule for the well being of the ruled, constantly making decisions and saying, that's still the way to live. The best human being understands the theoretical foundation for why we're capable of understanding these things, why there are patterns in human culture, in human history, why they're based on the human condition, why fear, pleasure, and pain are not ever going to go away. You can use them to create a sense of loyalty, trust, goodwill, and a stable society. You can use them to undermine and destabilize. All these other qualities of character, the virtues, are a natural product of ourselves as evolved creatures who desire to understand. We're social by nature, so friendships matter to us. We're political by nature, so the rule of law, political association matters to us. We're, and so the lodestone, right, the goal is the same. And someone with a mind, a highly educated mind, will possess practical wisdom and theoretical wisdom. They will understand the basic foundations and that there are patterns, we can understand them, that culture should be integrated with nature. We should not exploit nature indefinitely without a plan. We should plan for sustainability in order to have stability. Sustainability in our relation to nature will lead to stability in our culture. And then we should check out these patterns in human behavior. The patterns in human behavior are not as predictable, but they're not unintelligible. And it's a lifetime process of education, partly because there's so many variables. Literally, you learn about a new kind of vice, or a new kind of mistake, or a new kind of excuse. Like Snowden, all the debates about Mr. Snowden, that was partly old issues about privacy, about power, and partly a totally new version of what happens. So we have novelty based on social evolution, the increasing complexity of society, but then we have some of the same old issues and drives, fear, greed, um, uh, the possibility of outside attack, that sort of stuff. It's a similarity and difference. And life, once you get to understanding that, your mind can be totally active. You learn how to educate yourself. And you also learn how to educate each other. You have friendships based on acting in ways that are just or deliberating about how other people act. And I think this is really important. And I think um, I'm disappointed in the quality of deliberation that goes on in my country. But again, I don't know a lot. I'm pretty isolated in my lifestyle. I don't like to make a hasty generalization. I certainly hope that people around their fireplace, in their places where they congregate, will have high quality of engagement and conversation and reflection about political affairs. I think that the Greek system of education, that the culture they wanted to pass down, is very consistent with the model of liberal learning. And I'll just give you an example from my own catalog in the school I teach at. I teach at a private liberal arts college. And we have in our catalog a list of the 5 character traits, I would say. I think they call them values and virtues or something, of a liberally minded person, a liberally educated person. um, Commitment to truth, intellectual honesty, fairness to opposing points of view, patience with complexity and ambiguity, tolerance of reasoned dissent. I think it's great. And I think the Greeks, that's what they wanted. um, they wanted people to be liberal in the sense of generous and self-control, but also be liberal-minded in this sense so that you could actually avoid ignorance. You could compromise. You could learn how to make the best decision in a given situation. You're not going to be able to do that unless you're fair to opposing points of view, you tolerate complexity and ambiguity, so that you don't think you're solving a problem to a greater extent than you are. You're just solving it to the best you can, understanding there's a lot of complexity and ambiguity, understanding you might have to revisit a decision pretty quickly afterwards or later on. Um, you tolerate, you agree to disagree with people, so that even though a decision has to be made, someone might feel like they've been overpowered, they at least feel like they've been heard, and then when the situation gets revisited, they'll be able to engage. If you're intellectually honest, if you're committed to truth, you should be able to solve problems. Another big issue is to prevent unnecessary problems, suffering, and injustice. The human condition itself lends itself to a lot of suffering, but there's a difference between the suffering that's caused by simply human vulnerability or extenuating circumstances or just ignorance that was a matter of accident, not choice, and just suffering that's caused by wickedness, deliberate ignorance, like drunkenness, having the wrong goal, greed, or pride, or going to an extreme, or not being able to apply the principle in the situation. All these sort of character weaknesses, those are unnecessary injustices, unnecessary suffering. And we have to make a big distinction between those. And we have to constantly be distinguishing. Is there something I did to bring this on? Is this just something I didn't have any control over? Those are really important questions. And we have to constantly be educating ourselves and each other on these questions. I think there are many possible books and programs for triggering this kind of self-conscious awareness, critical thinking. But I'm going to present you with the one that I'm most familiar with.